Begin with this prayer. The words of my mouth, the meditation of my heart, be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, rock, my Redeemer. Amen. At first, I didn't believe what the guide was telling us as we stood under the tree in the jungle. I was in Ecuador at the time, and we were on a big jungle walk. We had a guide, and he was taking us around, and he stopped us under this tree, and he said he wanted us to try the fruit of the tree. So we picked up one of the fruits. It kind of looked like a yellow football, like a spaghetti squash, kind of a size. So we cut it open. When you opened it up, you could see a whole lot of, there were dark colored seeds inside, covered in this white, milky pulp stuff, so it looked pretty gross. So then he starts taking handfuls and he gives it to everybody, and he's like, "Oh, good, suck on the seed, don't bite down, don't swallow it." They're about almond-sized, really hard seeds, but that outer milky white covering was actually sweet if you sucked on it. And then you just spit the seed out, and that was it. He said if you bite down, the seed is really hard and it's very bitter. This was the proper way to say it, I think, is the cacao tree. I'm just going to call it cocoa for the rest of the sermon because that's way easier for me. So it's the cocoa tree. This is the tree that produces chocolate. And those little brown seeds that you couldn't bite into because they're so hard and they're really bitter, you actually crush up into powder, and that makes cocoa powder from what we make chocolate. It was strange at first, that tree and the seeds and the fruit didn't look anything like chocolate. It's funny how many times in our lives there are bitter situations that in time actually become sweet or pleasant. Naomi, this is the mother-in-law of Ruth, she had lots of very bitter things happen to her in her life, but she trusted that when God leads, your heart has rest. Naomi lived at the time of the Judges in the Old Testament. This is a time period between Moses leading the people out of Egypt. It's around 1400 BC. And the time of the kings that started with King Saul, King David, King Solomon. That's around 1000 BC. So Naomi lived about 3,000 years ago. So it's not a good time to be alive in Israel. It was very chaotic. It was basically anarchy for the people at that time. See, God had wanted, after he delivered the people from Egypt, to be really their king, to be everything that they needed, to give them guidance, even to fight their battles for them, to provide them with this new land of Israel. But of course, Israel rebelled against God, and they didn't want to follow him. So every now and again, they'd have a judge rise up, and eventually they had kings. So it's not a good time in Israel's history. In fact, in the book of Judges itself, in chapters 17 and 21, it says that in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. It's basically chaos. This is what Naomi lived in. This was her life. It wasn't a great life, and also during her lifetime there was a famine in Israel, so they relocated to the neighboring country of Moab, which wasn't great because Israel and the Moabites didn't get along. They didn't like each other at all. So Naomi's life is characterized by bitterness. She lived at a chaotic time. She lived during a famine. She had to move to a place with people she didn't even like and leave behind everything that she was used to. And on top of that, when she moved there, her husband passed away, leaving her with her 2 sons, which she loved. She loved her 2 sons. She was happy to see them get married, except for the fact that they married Moabite women instead of Israelite women, so that didn't sit too well with her. And then eventually her 2 sons die, and they die before she gets any grandchildren. Naomi's life was characterized by bitterness. Mothers, as you hear all the things that happened to Naomi in her life, I want you to consider your lives and your situations. This is Mother's Day, after all. So mothers, you may not live in a country that's in anarchy. As you watch the news and as you talk with other people, you're probably realizing that the political gaps in our country are becoming a little bit more divided. People are becoming more hostile. It's not a great place to raise kids, and it's kind of scary to think about what it's going to be like for your kids once they grow up. You may not live during a famine, but have you ever worried about money in your family? Has there ever been a moment where you wondered if in the savings or checking account or on the credit cards, if you're going to have enough money, not just for food, but you got to pay insurance, you got to pay for the cars, you got to pay for the house. You might want to go on vacation because you need one. There's all those other little expenses that you don't even think of, and they all add up. And eventually, because you don't have enough money to do the things that you need to do or want to do, you end up arguing with your spouse. And sometimes the stress of those arguments gets so bad that it actually does threaten your marriage. Maybe you've lost a spouse. Maybe you've lost a child. Or maybe your children are still alive, but the person that they've married is someone that the family did not want them to marry. And now that adds just all this tension in the family, and it's put a lot of stress on you and the family, and that weighs heavy on your heart. Or maybe none of that describes you. Maybe it's Mother's Day and your whole family's going to get together and there's going to be no troubles and no arguments. And your family's going to get together and they're just going to shower you moms with endless gifts and admiration. I mean, I hope that's the case, but if we're honest with ourselves, probably is not the case. We all have bitter situations in our lives, but they don't have to make us bitter. The kinds of situations that affected Naomi, the kinds of situations that affect you are probably enough to make you feel helpless sometimes, which makes you feel hopeless. Then you become anxious. And over time, all that stress and that anxiety, it wells up inside of you. And if you keep it inside of you, it actually leads to physical health problems. Sometimes you become so anxious, you feel physically sick. Sometimes you need to actually start to take medication because you feel so helpless and so anxious at times. Sometimes that hopelessness wells up inside of you, and those dark thoughts well up inside of you that you actually despair for your life. Or maybe you don't keep it in. Maybe all that stress and the frustrations about the bitter things that are going on in your life, they well up and they actually come out. And then you have hurtful words and actions that affect acquaintances or friends or coworkers. But if we're really honest with ourselves, a lot of times we hold it in really well with those people who aren't that close to us. And when the stress and anxiety wells up, it actually comes out at people that we really care about. And we end up hurting our closest friends and family. We all have bitter situations in our lives. They're unavoidable. But they don't have to cause us to be bitter. Because we have hope. We have hope that doesn't come from ourselves. See, if you're looking at one of these self-help books or a blog or something you find on the internet or a TV program or a podcast that tells you that in order to get out of these situations, you just need to become your best self. You just need to change your attitude or maybe just get out of those toxic situations. You need to do all these things so that your life is better. Did you notice there's a lot of you need to do these things? And yet you're seeking out these things because you feel overwhelmed. So those self-help books aren't really all that helpful. Really, you just want help from somebody else. You don't want to be alone, fighting against these battles and these things that weigh down on your hearts. And you especially don't want to be alone on Mother's Day. Naomi was not alone. She lost her husband. She had lost her sons, but she still had her two daughters-in-law. And she finally was going to get some good news. She was with her daughters-in-law in this foreign country during this time of a famine, but then she got news from back home. While she was in Moab, Naomi heard that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. So the famine that was going on in Israel was now over. And she and her daughters-in-law then prepared to return home from there. Finally, there was good news. Finally, the famine was over. Maybe she could go home and have a little piece of something that was familiar and relatively pleasant. And she planned to bring her daughters-in-law at first. Then as she thought about it, she realized, if you come with me, you won't have a home. You won't have a job. You won't have income. You won't have a family. So She encouraged her daughters-in-law actually to stay behind, and she was going to go herself. One of the daughters-in-law listened to her, but one would not. Ruth would not leave Naomi's side. She said that she loved Naomi, and more than that, she loved Naomi's God. Time and time again, Naomi tried to encourage Ruth to stay, but Ruth said, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Naomi couldn't keep Ruth from following her, and so the two returned together to Israel. The bitter situations continued. When they got back, they decided to settle in the town of Bethlehem. A lot of you probably know Bethlehem. It's in Judah. They settled there because Naomi was from that tribe of Judah. So she settled there with her people. When she got back and news spread around town that Naomi was back and all the people came to talk with her, Naomi asked that she no longer be called Naomi, but instead to be called Mara. Mara means bitterness in the Hebrew language. God had allowed so many bitter things to consume her, she just wanted to be known as bitter. And on top of that, now that they were back and they had no husbands, they had no income, no home, Ruth had to take care of Naomi by going out into the fields, and she followed behind the harvesters, and she picked up whatever she could find. They were living on scraps. It seemed like the bitterness was going to continue now for both of them. When I was in the jungle, and the guide handed us all of those seeds to suck on, I thought, there's no way that this is what chocolate is made out of. The seeds were really hard. They were bitter. We all bit into it a little bit to see if it really was hard and bitter. You have to. And he was right. They're really hard. They do not taste good at all. But we know that does turn into chocolate. It's just a long process. The trees have to grow in the right conditions. You have to pick the fruit. You got to cut them open. You got to get all that weird white milky stuff off of the outside. Then you have to dry them. You have to ship them to a plant to get them processed. They all have to get crushed up. Finally, they have to heat that liquid up, or that powder up, and it turns into a liquid. And they have to mix in the right amount of milk and sugar. You got to add sugar because chocolate is naturally bitter. And finally, you turn something bitter into something that is pleasant. And after a very long time, Naomi was finally going to get something that was pleasant for her life. Turns out the very field that Ruth was trying to pick up all the leftovers from the barley harvest, that field belonged to a man named Boaz. Boaz was a very close relative of Naomi's late husband. This allowed him to function as what happened in Israel. There was a position called a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer, so a kinsman, somebody like a close relative, someone who would redeem you, someone who would save you, buy you back from whatever bad situation that you were in. So this responsibility could fall to Boaz. Now when Boaz found out all the things that Ruth had been doing for Naomi, he showed her kindness. Told all the workers in his field to, let a couple of things fall out of your bags and allow her to pick up a little bit more so that she and Naomi would have things to eat. And when Ruth got back and told Naomi about all the kindness that Boaz had shown her, she realized that Boaz was this kinsman redeemer. And so she told Ruth to go and let him know that she was willing to get married to him so that he could redeem her and Naomi. So Ruth goes and she presents herself to Boaz, and he's willing to marry her, to redeem her and Naomi, to allow Naomi to have the possession of the lands of her husband and to allow her husband's name to continue within the tribes of Israel. They found out there was one man that was a little bit closer, so they had to make sure that it was okay with him that Boaz would be the one to redeem them, and he was okay with that. So Boaz and Ruth get married. Finally, Naomi can now rest secure. At least she's going to have a home. She's going to have some kind of an income. And not only that, after they get married, they get pregnant. They're going to have a son. And so, Finally, in Ruth chapter 4, we hear that Naomi took that child in her arms and she cared for him. And it says that the women living there said, Naomi has a son. So these same women who Naomi had gone to and said, call me Mara, because my life is bitter. Now these same women got to see all that had been done for her, that her life had been completely changed around because she now had this Redeemer working everything out for her good. And we further hear that they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. So through Naomi's daughter-in-law Ruth, we eventually get to King David, who was the ancestor of Mary and Joseph, who was the parents of Jesus. God allowed this bitterness to linger in Naomi's life, but he always had a plan to redeem her. Naomi was redeemed because of Boaz and what he had done. Redeemed because now they had finally a grandchild, and she knew that her husband's name in the family would continue. But more than that, Boaz and Ruth and Naomi were all followers of the one true God, the God of Israel, and they knew that he was going to send a Redeemer someday. And that Redeemer came from her very family. God had always planned to send Jesus to redeem all of us from all of the bitter situations that sin causes in our lives. Sin causes us to hurt others, and that hurt also causes pain in our lives, and that hurt can build up and make us bitter. So bitter that we actually lose hope in God, which really is the goal of the devil and our sinful nature, is to lose our faith in God. But Jesus took all of that bitterness on himself, and he traded his perfect life for our sinful lives on the cross. He redeemed us. He bought us back. The currency that he used was his life. And so now you have life. Life will cause us bitter situations. Period. You will have bad things happen in your life. Probably not a surprise to any of you. But that doesn't mean you have to be bitter. Instead, you know that God has prepared pleasant things for you. And in fact, Naomi's name actually means pleasant in the Hebrew. God always knew that good things were going to happen to Naomi. It took a while, but finally she was redeemed, and she had that hope in her Savior. And Jesus kept all of his promises to redeem us too, and on Thursday we would have celebrated the ascension of Jesus. He waits for us in heaven now at the right hand of God. He stands there in heaven every time that something happens to you, every time that guilt builds up in your heart, every time that you have hopelessness. You know that God is there and he is on your side. Jesus has a place waiting for you in heaven. And before he ascended into heaven, he said these words in John chapter 14 to his disciples so that we could read them too and have that strength and faith. He said, "My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am." Heaven is ours through Jesus and all he's done for us. And so I pray that today you have a very pleasant Mother's Day. Maybe there's even going to be a little bittersweet chocolate wait for you back home. I don't know. I pray that you have a mother who knows her Redeemer. A mother that knows her Redeemer understands that there will be bitter situations in her life, in her marriage, in the lives of her children. But it doesn't overwhelm her because she knows Jesus. A mother who knows her Redeemer is a lot like Naomi, who lived at a horrible time in Israel's history, who endured a famine, who had to move to a country of people that didn't like her and she didn't really like them, who saw her husband and her 2 sons die, returned home and lived as a beggar for a little while. And she always had hope that God would pull things through for her. And he did. And he has done it for you. So I pray that all of you, mothers, fathers, children, all of you, have that same faith in Jesus. And King Solomon also had some things to say about mothers. King Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. God gave him incredible wisdom, and so he wrote his book of Proverbs. And the very final chapter of Proverbs ends with these words: "A wife of noble character who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord, a woman who believes in Jesus, is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate." Naomi endured a lot of bitterness, maybe even more than any of you had. But she always knew that God was going to bring pleasant things for her. And you have the ability to look back and see what God has done for you. So as you endure those things, be like Naomi. Trust God to lead, and trust that he has provided you the ultimate rest. Amen.